Hello everyone, welcome to the second video in the Monopolistic competition video series. In this video, we're going to be going through how a monopolist or a monopolistic competitor chooses the price and quantity that it's going to sell its goods for and sell its goods at. In this video, we're going to be analyzing the short run equilibrium and the long run equilibrium that comes about from monopolistic competitors. And an interesting finding occurs when we compare the short run to the long run equilibriums. In that, in the short run for a monopolistic competitor, they are able to earn very high short-run economic profits because in the short run, these types of firms can behave exactly like a monopoly. But we'll find that in the long term, because there are no barriers to entry, like with a monopoly, these firms in monopolistic competition with one another do not earn long-term economic profits, just like perfect competition. So to kind of summarize what this video is going to discuss and find, that there is a difference between the short run outcomes and the long run outcomes for monopolistic competition. In the short run, it's going to look identical to a monopoly. And in the long run, it's going to look more like perfect competition. So this is something that's very unique and special about firms that operate in this monopolistic competition with one another. So let's go ahead and dive right into this video. So just like we learned at the end of the last video, the monopolistic competitor, like a monopolist, faces a downward sloping demand curve. So in the last video, we kind of ended here, where we showed that the perfect competitor's demand curve is perfectly elastic, and the monopolist demand curve is pretty steep compared to a perfect competitor's. And monopolistic competition kind of falls in the middle of these two market structures, which makes sense because monopolistic competition falls in between these two market structures on that competition spectrum that we keep talking about in all of these videos. So because this monopolistic competitor faces a downward sloping demand curve, the monopolistically competitive firm decides on its profit maximizing quantity and price in much of the same way like a monopolist does. So it's going to choose some combination of price and quantity along this perceived demand curve. So we could go through and make that same little chart that we did for a monopoly that has the demand and the marginal revenue and all of that. But just to make things easier and simpler, since we already did that in a previous video, just assume that we can do the exact same thing for a monopolistic competitor. Again, the key thing to note here is that we can only assume that a monopolistic competitor behaves similarly to a monopoly in the short run. So why is this the case? So thinking back to what defines a firm as being a monopolistic competition, the key thing that kind of makes a monopolistically competitive firm special than like perfect competition is that each firm in a monopolistic competition setting is selling similar goods, but they are differentiated in some way. So in perfect competition, everyone is selling the exact identical good. But with monopolistic competition, every single business in a certain industry is selling a product that is similar but slightly different from one another on, different variables. So the color of the product could be different, the size of the product could be different, the guarantees and warranties attached to the product could be different, etc., etc. So there are little slight differences between the products that monopolistic competitors are selling. And because of this, in the short run, each one of these different industries that's selling a product that's slightly different kind of has this mini monopoly on that one type of product. So, if we're talking about shoes, for example, there are many different brands of companies that make shoes. And Nike has its own mini monopoly on Nike brand shoes. Adidas has its own mini monopoly on Adidas brand shoes, etc., etc. So each company has its own mini monopoly in the short run. So that is why, in the short run, these firms can behave like they are a monopoly. But in the long term and over time, these, differentiated kind of barriers between these companies kind of fall away, and perfect competition or close to perfect competition can exist between these firms, which is why in the long term, the profits that these companies make fall to zero. So again, in the short run, profit maximization for the monopolistically competitive firm looks exactly like a monopoly. So if you remember the monopoly profit maximizing video, this should be very straightforward. They're going to produce the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The price that they charge is going to be on the demand curve. And this is going to be similar to a monopoly. Okay, so I have this whiteboard drawn up so we can go through and kind of review how a monopolistic competitor will choose its price and quantity in the short run. Again, in the short run, a monopolistic competitor is going to behave exactly like a monopoly would. So just like a monopoly, the monopolistic competitor faces a downward sloping demand curve. And because of that, the marginal revenue curve is going to be underneath of the demand curve at exactly half of the slope. And then the marginal cost curve is just going to look like this. So to figure out the price and the quantity that a monopolistic competitor is going to charge, we just do the following three-step process, just like we did for a monopoly. So for step one, if we're trying to find the quantity, we look to the quantity where marginal revenue is exactly equal to marginal cost. So we know that if we look over to our picture, we see that these two curves intersect at this point here. So this is going to be the quantity that this monopolistic competitor is going to produce in the short run. The price that they're going to charge for this quantity is going to be from this intersection point, go straight up to the demand curve. So once we find the intersection point here, we can go straight up to the demand curve. And this is the price that the monopolistic competitor is going to charge. So price is on the demand curve. Okay. So again, if we have already watched the Monopoly profit maximizing video, finding the price and quantity for a monopolistic competitor is exactly the same in the short run. But if we look to the long run, we find that this monopoly kind of equilibrium does not hold if we are looking at an extended amount of time. So let's just assume that because the monopolistic competitor is able to charge this higher price for its goods in the short run, that a certain competitor in this monopolistic competition framework is making a pretty sizable profit in the short run. Now, if a monopolistically competitive firm is making a profit in the short run, new firms are going to kind of see that profit and say, hey, maybe it's a good idea that I start a business that sells something just like that company does, and I can enter the market and take away some of their profit and make some profit for myself. So if new firms see this profit being made in the short run, there's incentive for them to want to enter the market, which increases the number of products being sold. So essentially, in the long run, the quantity produced by all of the firms is going to increase. And because more firms are now entering the market and selling a good that is similar but maybe slightly different, this essentially reduces the demand faced by each individual firm. So if a brand new shoe company opens up, it may take away some business from Nike or from Adidas. So the demand for Nike shoes or the demand for Adidas shoes may decrease. And if demand shifts to the left, this causes prices to also decrease. So because of this free entry of other firms, because there aren't any barriers to entry, like there were with Monopoly, each firm's individual profit eventually declines to zero. So because there's new products flooding the market and the prices are going to be falling for everyone, every firm in the long run is going to make zero economic profit. And this zero economic profit in the long run looks very similar to perfect competition, which we've already talked about in class. So again, in the short run, monopolistic competition looks just like monopoly. And in the long run, monopolistic competition looks more like perfect competition. So that's kind of why the name monopolistic competition is kind of like a combination of both of those two market structure types. Monopoly in the short run, perfect competition in the long run. However, there is one key difference between the monopolistic competitor in the long run and perfect competition in the long run. And that is when the monopolistic competition market reaches its long run equilibrium, like is shown in this picture, we can see that the price that the monopolistic competitor reaches in the long run is going to be slightly higher than what the price would be in the long run for perfect competition. So remember, in perfect competition, in the long run equilibrium for perfect competition, the perfect competitors choose a price exactly equal to where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So the price in perfect competition in the long run would be right here. But because a monopolistic competitor is able to start out in the short run by charging a higher price, the price that the good reaches in the long run for monopolistic competition doesn't fall all the way back down to what it would be in perfect competition. Yes, it falls a little bit, but it only falls to a certain point. So there is a discrepancy between what the long run price would be in monopolistic competition versus what the long run price would be in perfect competition. And the key difference here is that if we were in perfect competition, the price would be much lower in the long run than what the price is in monopolistic competition in the long run. So we can essentially say that there's this markup of the price that still exists even in the long run whenever we're talking about monopolistic competition. And another thing to note here is that there is a difference between perfect competition and monopolistic competition whenever we're talking about efficiency. So remember in perfect competition, we noted that firms will produce at the lowest possible average total cost. But we saw in the previous picture that the long run equilibrium here is not at the lowest possible point on the average total cost curve. So there is still room for firms to be more productively efficient in monopolistic competition compared to perfect competition. So in perfect competition, we'd be producing here at the lowest possible average total cost. But with monopolistic competition, we are producing on the downward sloping part of the average total cost curve, not at the very bottom of the average total cost curve. So monopolistic competition, therefore, is not productively efficient. Businesses are not producing the goods at the lowest possible price that they can. Perfect competition, however, does display this productive efficiently. Goods are produced at the lowest possible average total cost. So again, just to kind of summarize the differences here between long run perfect competition and long run monopolistic competition is that in the long run, monopolistic competition has this markup effect that still persists from the short run, in that the price that the monopolistic competitor is much higher than the average or the marginal cost, whereas in perfect competition, it would be exactly equal to the marginal cost. So the final part of this video is going to briefly go through what kind of welfare effects does monopolistic competition have on society. And what we learned from the previous slide is that monopolistically competitive markets don't really have all of the desirable welfare properties of perfectly competitive markets. Even in the long run, monopolistically competitive firms are going to be charging higher prices than what we would find in perfect competition. And also the businesses and the firms that are producing these monopolistically competitive goods are not producing them at the lowest possible average total cost. So again, there's some characteristics of monopolistic competition that make it, not as desirable compared to perfect competition. So again, the sources of this inefficiency, which we just talked about, come from the markup of the price over the marginal cost, and also from the number of firms that are in the market. And to end this video, we're going to, briefly talk about these two kind of contrasting effects that may contribute to the welfare of society. So whenever there is monopolistic competition, there's kind of this push and pull between these two different phenomenons. So in monopolistic competition, if there are a lot of different firms in a monopolistically competitive setting, there could be product variety benefits, but there could also be business stealing costs. So the product variety benefits really benefit the consumers of this particular market. So if there are a lot of businesses producing shoes in a particular market, consumers might get some, extra benefit, extra surplus from the introduction of new brands of shoes. Certain consumers may really like the fact that there is variety and options for them to choose different types of shoes compared to if there were only, one, two, or three really big firms producing shoes. So this could, positively impact society in a certain way where consumers get these extra benefits from variety. But there could also be business stealing costs associated with monopolistic competition. There could be losses incurred by existing firms when new firms enter the market. And some of these business stealing costs particularly come from advertising, which will be more thoroughly discussed in the next video.